Under a blood-red sky, crows hovered, cawing ominously over a lifeless battlefield. Amidst broken swords and rubble, a warrior lay on his back, alone in the devastation. The warrior slowly regained consciousness, the harsh signs of battle, bruises and blood, visible on his face, wondering to himself if he had fainted. With great effort, he managed to lift his torso and sit up, surveying the destruction around him and his massive sword lying nearby. Two questions occupied his mind. How long had he been unconscious, and what had happened to the battle? Suddenly, while lost in thought, a sharp, excruciating pain shot through his chest, causing him to bend forward, clutching the source of the pain, concluding that some of his ribs were broken. Despite his severe injury, he gathered what remained of his resolve, realizing he could still move. He began to look around for his comrades, but what he saw filled his heart with sorrow, as he found the bodies of his team members strewn everywhere. One of his comrades, the mage in the orange robe, had been fighting bravely, using his glowing talismans to fend off two dark enemies, before a violent explosion flashed. The scene then shifted to the main adversary, the Demon King, a giant armored figure carrying a deadly purple sword on his shoulder under the shadow of an eternal black eclipse. The blonde-haired hero faced him with all courage. The Demon King had revealed his true power, the authority of the Demon King. A fog appeared, beginning to gather around and under the hero's feet, from which a massive army of the undead emerged. The warrior was surprised by the appearance of such a large number of undead, concluding that this was a power the Demon King had hidden until that moment. He shouted, calling to his team members for help. "Priest!" The priest turned towards the source of the sound, the warrior Rogue. Rogue asked the priest to cast the authority spell on him and charged at full speed towards the Demon King. The priest cast the authority spell on Rogue, chanting, "You who have realized the authority, lend us your power." In response to that call, he activated his ability, Authority of Light, Painful Oblivion, on Rogue, which resulted in a massive explosion of white light that overwhelmed the darkness. Rogue charged with all his might, shattering all the undead who stood in his way, but the army of the undead was endless, rushing towards him relentlessly, leaving him no chance to catch his breath or steady his feet. Rogue swung his sword violently, the blows raining down like a storm, cutting the undead to pieces. Declaring that he would take care of all the enemies to clear the path for his comrade, Rogue screamed at the top of his lungs, a cry that shook the battlefield, encouraging the hero to advance and face the Demon King without hesitation. The hero advanced steadily towards the Demon King, his eyes filled with determination, his sword gleaming with power, ready for the confrontation with all his courage, his energy clashing with the king's purple energy in a final decisive duel. The sounds of collision between the hero's sword and the Demon King's power echoed, each blow shaking the ground, but despite the fierce battle, both stood firm, with no clear victor. The violent fight between them caused the complete destruction of their surroundings. The conflict between the hero and the Demon King intensifies. In a decisive moment, the hero delivers a crushing blow with his sword. The hero's sword penetrates the Demon King's body, severing his arm. The hero declared before the Demon King that it was over. The hero stared at the Demon King with a sharp gaze, pointing his sword at him, asserting that his end was inevitable. The Demon King's arm was healing at an insane speed. In a moment of carelessness, he extended his powerful hand and grabbed the hero with lightning speed. The Demon King spoke with an ominous calm, asserting that there is no end but merely a continuation. His body began to glow with unstable energy, and the hero realized his opponent was planning to self-destruct. Before the explosion could engulf everything, Rogue suddenly appeared, looking at the hero who seemed frozen in place, wondering why he had stopped. Rogue severed the Demon King's hand that held the hero with all his might, while he remained to face death, declaring that if they must die, they would die together. The hero screamed the thief's name in despair as a massive explosion consumed both the thief and the Demon King. In the aftermath of the explosion, only silence remained, before a towering, mysterious black pillar known as the Abyss Transition erupted from the ground. The priest looked at the pillar in confusion, wondering what it was. Meanwhile, the hero, who survived thanks to his comrade's sacrifice, saw Rogue's specter and thought he had safely escaped the explosion. But the hero froze in shock when he saw Rogue with a massive hole in his body from the explosion. At that moment, another monster appeared on the battlefield, looking at the fading remains of the Demon King. It expressed its disappointment, having expected to witness its master's ascension to the throne of power, but what happened seemed nothing but a futile death. Suddenly, Rogue, despite his injury, rose and charged, kicking the monster directly in the face with great force. The monster noticed that Rogue had somehow survived the explosion. Its astonishment grew as it realized the truth. Rogue's survival meant he too possessed the qualification to ascend the throne of authority. He threw Rogue to the ground. Rogue shouted to the hero, alerting him that this was the right moment to attack. The hero and the priest responded immediately, summoning the authority of light in the form of his holy sword, Ascalon. With one decisive blow, He brought the sword down on the monster, shattering it completely. After the dust settled, the mage appeared, asking with concern if both the hero and rogue were safe. The hero calls for the priest to come to him, and the priest expresses his relief that they are safe. When he arrives, he notices Rogue's body next to the hero, whose wounds have begun to regenerate and heal on their own, much to his surprise. From a distance, the Demon King's follower watches the scene, thinking to himself that although he was momentarily confused, things are proceeding as they should. He then asks the priest if the hero received the blessing all right. The hero turns towards the Demon King, who is still alive despite everything. The Demon King reassures the hero not to worry, explaining that his physical body has served its purpose and is beginning to collapse, and that victory was ultimately theirs. In his final message, he tells him that his story has ended here, and now it is the hero's turn to begin his story. The Demon King predicts that the hero will be forced to make countless choices and will sink into a deeper despair than ever before, and that even if he falls and is crushed by the responsibility placed upon him, he must pray, never stop, and keep moving forward. His last wish was for the hero's journey to have a different ending than his own, which he described as empty and foolish, with his last trace vanishing, and the sky left clear. The battle that determined the fate of the world ended. After that, the days passed quickly. The mage was captured by the headmaster of the magic school and returned to it. The fairy also embarked on a journey back to her homeland. As for the priest, he gave his final farewells and left the mortal world once again. The hero was crowned king, amidst the celebration of his people, and Rogue also returned to his original place. Thus, the false light faded, life began to stir again under the sun's rays, and fear left people's daily lives, beginning an era of peace that lasted for a long time. Approximately 150 years later, a person with a skull-like head sits leaning against a tree, declaring that he too is continuing on his path. It becomes clear that this person is Rogue, a former member of the hero's party, now over 150 years old, wondering if he has caught a cold. He contemplates the immense changes that have occurred in the world around him, where mountains that seemed unmovable have crumbled and flat plains have turned into barren deserts. Rogue continued his contemplation under the starlight, thinking that the only thing that hadn't changed after all these years were the stars and himself, but he quickly corrected himself, realizing that even he had changed. He looked at his wrinkled hand as he thought about the curse of immortality that had befallen him. What was supposed to be a blessing granted to him by the Demon King before his death was, in reality, an eternal curse that would never disappear. He questioned the purpose of this immortality, the meaning of his existence if he couldn't even disappear, and his fate to remain alone forever. While lost in his existential thoughts, a falling star caught his attention. A small child passed in front of him, who, upon seeing him, screamed in astonishment, pointing out that he was a skeleton. After 150 years since the battle with the Demon King, the time that had stopped for Rogue began to flow again. On a mountain behind the village of Chang Tap, on the outskirts of the empire, the little girl looked at Rogue with curiosity. Rogue wondered why she was in this place so late at night. Suddenly, the girl grabbed Rogue's face, shocking him, as she exclaimed in wonder at him being a talking skeleton. Rogue asked her to stop, telling her he had seen many children get lost in the mountains, but she was the first to pat him like this. He then asked her disapprovingly if she hadn't learned to run away upon seeing something inhuman. The girl replied innocently that she was taught not to judge others by their appearance. Rogue grumbled to himself that he was feeling nostalgic and emotional for the first time in a long while, only to be interrupted by this strange girl's appearance. The girl eagerly asked about Rogue's identity, and noticing his strange sword, she asked if he was a knight. Rogue denied being a master and began to boast that he was an imperial messenger who travels across the country carrying the emperor's messages, and that he was currently protecting this mountain with a cursed sword. This impressed the girl, who concluded that an imperial messenger must be very strong, which Rogue proudly agreed with. Continuing his boasting, Rogue explained that this was not a job anyone could do, but required knowledge of high-level magic like summoning spirits. To prove his point, he summoned a small, purple, ghostly creature from his sword. The girl's fascination grew, and she exclaimed excitedly that Rogue must be really strong. Then, with shining eyes, she asked Rogue to accept her as his disciple because she wanted to become strong. Rogue laughed, thinking to himself that he had been getting bored with his repetitive daily routine, but he refused the girl's request, saying it was a bother. The girl was surprised by the refusal and asked him if the story wasn't supposed to go with him accepting her as his disciple. The little girl did not accept Rogue's refusal and began to plead with him insistently, calling him stingy and a heartless skeleton. Rogue ignored the rest of her words and replied sharply, confirming once again that he was not a master. The next morning, as Rogue was relaxing under the tree, he was surprised to find the girl still there, shouting enthusiastically and practicing with a stick as a sword. He asked if she was going home, but she stubbornly declared that she would not leave until he taught her swordsmanship. Rogue urged her to go home, expressing his concern that her parents would worry, and complained that because of his skeletal appearance, he was often mistaken for a monster who kidnaps children. The girl told him not to worry about that, then revealed sadly that their house had burned down and her parents had died in the accident. She added that her mother had told her before she died that she must become strong to survive on her own, which is why she was so insistent on learning to fight. She then looked at him seriously and asked if he understood her situation now. Rogue sighed slowly, and after a moment of silence, he finally agreed to teach her swordsmanship. The girl was overjoyed and asked him to confirm he meant what he said. Rogue replied affirmatively, adding in a calm tone that he couldn't keep refusing a child's request, which confused the girl for a moment. The girl quickly dismissed it and thanked him enthusiastically. Afterward, Rogue looked up at the sky as if addressing the late emperor, saying that his people had gone through a great ordeal, and for that reason, he would teach this child how to be self-reliant, considering it an atonement for his failure to deliver the emperor's message. From that day on, her long training journey began. Days and years passed as they trained together, sharing moments of rest under the tree. Rogue would summon monsters from his sword, and the girl would begin training to fight them. They would even sometimes scare travelers, as a form of play, and a strong, unique bond grew between them. They came to depend on each other's presence. The girl gradually improved in her use of the sword. During her training with Rogue, the girl would exchange blows with him fiercely. Despite this, they were both happy with the time they spent together. After 11 years had passed, Rogue, who had caught a rabbit, called out, "Girl, come and eat." A young woman with long blonde hair replied, "Yes, master." After 11 years, the little girl had grown into an attractive young woman. She sat beside Rogue to tell him she had something serious to discuss. Rogue asked her what was so important that it changed the mood so suddenly. She sadly informed him that the village she used to live in had been abandoned by its people due to a sudden increase in monsters, and that the Empire had deserted it, causing everyone to lose hope. Then she declared that she had become strong enough. Rogue immediately realized she was planning to become a hero, and told her that after 11 years of training her, he could read her thoughts. He remembered his old friend, the hero, who had the same dream of helping people, and how despite the ridicule of those around him telling him he was unworthy, or that it was impossible, he would always reply that one doesn't need qualifications to save people. At that moment, Rogue decided to support her in her endeavor. As the sole heir and master of the northern hunting techniques, he gave her a dagger as a gift, maintaining their traditions. He wished that she would always use this sword with good intentions, and asked her to go save the world and then return to him, assuring her that he would always be waiting for her in the same place. After she left, Rogue was alone again, wondering how long her journey would take, expecting it might last 5 or 10 years. He just had to protect this place until then, believing that she would succeed in her mission and return. Rogue decided he just had to wait patiently for her return. This brief connection in his long life had changed him, unlike in the past. Waiting was no longer a frightening thing for him. After a long time, while he was sitting alone, he was surprised by her return, bearing the scars of a fierce battle. She greeted him, and he barely recognized her after all this time. The young woman began to enthusiastically recount her amazing adventures, and how the Empire was much larger than she had imagined, full of new places and things. But she also faced many monsters and used what she had learned from him to help people. Thanks to her actions, people started calling her the heroine, but this angered the emperor, who saw her as a thorn in his side and an obstacle to establishing his imperial authority, so he ordered her assassination. As she spoke, she started to feel dizzy and swayed, falling into his arms. In her final moments, she held him tightly and asked if he was okay, and if he had cried in her absence. In Rogue's arms, the heroine spoke her final words, expressing her wish to hear his story before she breathed her last. Rogue's eyes filled with anger and hatred towards all who had harmed her. Meanwhile, a troop of imperial knights arrived at the mountain. One of the soldiers grumbled that the cursed heroine did not die peacefully but came to this mountain to die. The commander ordered the soldier to be silent and continue the search. The knight commander discovered someone in the forest and ordered him to descend the mountain immediately and pack his things. It turned out this person was Rogue, who asked in surprise why he should leave the mountain, adding that this place was no longer a mountain. Rogue revealed his true power and summoned monsters, transforming the area into a horrific scene filled with the remains of monsters that attacked the knights. Rogue told them that 120 years ago, when he roamed the continent as a messenger, he found the remnants of the Demon King's army in this place. He crushed their heads and dismembered their bodies, which accumulated to form the soil of this land, and this forest grew upon it. Since then, he had been guarding this place, fearing that necromancers might misuse it, but it seemed there was no need for that now. Amidst the knights' astonishment, the commander ordered everyone to calm down and take their positions, explaining that a single necromancer's ability to control the undead is limited, regardless of the number of available corpses. But he stopped talking abruptly when he saw the size of the army Rogue had summoned. The commander realized there was no hope of facing such a massive number of monsters, a huge army of the undead advancing towards them. The commander asked in terror who Rogue was. Rogue gave the commander no chance and beheaded him before he could resist. With pride and anger, Rogue declared his true identity. He was not just a skeleton, but the mouth of the Emperor and the voice of the Empire. His voice echoed throughout the Empire, delivering a message to its people. People everywhere wondered what was happening. Then Rogue recited the founding Emperor's will. If the Empire deviates from the will of its founder, I grant the nobles and loyal subjects the right to restore it to its correct path. He then addressed his old homeland, declaring it was time for them to pay for their crimes. In a nearby village, the survivors of the monster attack saw the army of the undead approaching. They raised cries of warning, and the remaining soldiers rushed to fight the monsters with all their might. And the commander ordered the remaining units to assemble to repel the imminent attack. Amidst the blazing battlefield, the knights realized that what they were facing was not the work of an ordinary necromancer, but a full-fledged army of the undead. Faced with this imminent danger, Aishur ordered everyone to clear a path for him, preparing to unleash his first combat technique known as Wolf Hunt. Aishur launched his attack, wondering about the identity of the opponent capable of summoning an entire army. Aishur Soma was one of the Imperial Knights. A giant monster moving between the buildings in the village caught his attention. When he looked closer, he saw that the necromancer was being carried by the giant monster's hand, moving at the forefront of the undead army, which surprised him, as a mage like him was supposed to be protected behind his army of the undead instead of standing on the front lines. He prepared to strike with his wolf hunt technique again, and he cut off the giant monster's leg that was carrying Rogue, and he ambushed Rogue with a spear thrust that targeted his leg from an impossible angle. When he saw the attack that hit his leg, he concluded that Aishur was the one who had cut off the girl's leg. He charged at Aishur at full speed, seeing only one goal before him: to eliminate him. Aishur managed to block Rogue's attack with great difficulty. Aishur skillfully deflected Rogue's sword as he swung his own. Aishur exposed Rogue's body with a swift move, leaving him vulnerable to a direct combat attack. Aishur swung his sword at Rogue's head, but the latter deftly dodged the blow with ease. Rogue quickly rushed forward and kicked Aishur's leg with force, causing the latter to lose his balance. He then delivered a powerful punch to his face, knocking him to the ground. After that, Rogue pounced on Aishur, sitting on top of him, and began to rain down a continuous barrage of punches. But Aishur desperately tried to get up from that position, struggling to escape Rogue's violent grip. Aishur gathered what was left of his strength and kicked Rogue away with force, then swung his sword in the air to push him further away and give himself some space to catch his breath. He called his opponent a damned beast, admitting that it was the first time he had been pushed this far since his encounter with the four knights, then asked in confusion about his true identity. The answer came from Rogue, the Avenger. Aishur decided to himself that he needed to buy more time and perhaps provoke his opponent further. He scoffed at the idea of revenge, sarcastically asking who he was seeking vengeance for. He then boasted that he had killed so many that it was impossible for him to know which victim this Avenger had come for. Aishur knew that necromancy consumed a huge amount of energy, so he decided to stall to buy time until his opponent was exhausted. But his plan was shattered when the Avenger suddenly appeared beside him, placing a hand on his face. Aishur tried to resist, but Rogue quickly stabbed his hand with his sword, paralyzing him and making him unable to hold his weapon. Rogue condemned Aishur's boasting of killing, explaining that the people of the Empire and even his disciple, the heroine, had suffered because of this petty pursuit of power. Ignoring the pain in his hand, Aishur tried to attack Rogue with desperate resolve to cut him down. But Rogue kicked him hard, sending him flying away, and Aishur was thrown into the rubble. From among the wreckage, he justified his actions as being for the cause of the Empire, and that the deaths of those people were necessary. Rogue replied that he was a pathetic person, and that if his actions were necessary, then his death at his hands today was also necessary. But Aishur answered confidently that he would not die that day. Suddenly the sky split open as pillars of blue light ascended from the ground. This was the moment Aishur had been waiting for, as the anti-undead barrier shield had been prepared, using 155 human mana batteries. He declared his mission complete and ordered its activation. A massive wave of holy energy was unleashed, completely annihilating the army of the undead. The knights rejoiced at the disappearance of the monsters before them. Aishur told Rogue of his victory and that his army had been destroyed, explaining that this barrier was created by the mage of the hero's party 120 years ago and was described as the greatest in history. But Rogue calmly replied that he knew that, as he remembered well the stubborn craftsman's spirit that mage possessed. Aishur was surprised by what he saw, as Rogue declared that the army didn't matter to him, as he could summon another one. He explained that those who would stand with him this time were the victims of the Empire itself, the exploited citizens, who would join him in his quest for revenge, and he promised to bring an end to the Empire. His memories took him back to the past, and his old party, where they hated war but had to fight to protect what was precious to them. Those were days when death seemed inevitable, and he thought those days were gone forever. As Rogue delved deep into his memories, he found himself bitterly wondering if all those lives lost and sacrifices made were for a future like this. He found no satisfying answer, for all he knew was that he had once gone to the battlefield, but he no longer remembered the motive that drove him, or for whom he was fighting. In this time without them, he felt a deep sense of loss, wondering where he was supposed to go now. 4 days after the heroine's extermination, Rogue found himself in the Northern Adventurers' Village on the northern continent. He entered the Adventurers' Guild, the only place open at that time, and spread out an old map, asking for help in finding his way, explaining that he had lost his way while heading north along the mountains. One of the people there rudely replied that this was an Adventurers' Guild, not a local information office. But Rogue calmly asserted that he would leave as soon as he got what he wanted. The adventurer noticed that Rogue, who claimed to be lost, smelled strongly of blood. He added that he remembered an ominous rumor that had recently spread about a necromancer who killed knights and destroyed the village of Changtap behind the mountains. Without warning, the adventurer lunged at Rogue in a swift attack, then asked Rogue directly if that rumor was about him, revealing his skeletal face and shouting that he was a living dead. Rogue warned his attackers to choose their opponents wisely. Then he unleashed his power in a violent explosion, striking the ground with force and calling them children. With that decisive blow, Rogue was able to eliminate the assassin who was hiding underground, waiting for the right moment to pounce on him. The adventurers' leader admitted the failure of their ambush and ordered his men to kill him. Rogue received the order coldly, reminding them that he had done nothing but ask for help in finding his way, then clenched his fist, declaring that everything that happened from now on would be their fault alone. A huge man charged at him with a raised sword, shouting at him to die, but Rogue easily blocked the attack, then delivered a series of blows to him. He then delivered a final blow that knocked him to the ground. Another person charged at him, delivering a series of blows with his spear, but Rogue easily dodged his attacks. Rogue blocked the spear with his hand, which surprised his opponent. Rogue grabbed his opponent and threw him to the ground with force, then looked around to find 2 other people approaching him. The assassins tried to surround Rogue from the front and back so that he could not block either of them. Rogue skillfully dodged their joint attack. The 2 attackers were surprised by the failure of their attack, which they had thought would succeed easily. Rogue grabbed their heads together and slammed them hard on the ground. In an instant, he disappeared in the blink of an eye from before them, suddenly reappearing behind the adventurers' leader, who wondered in shock how he could have disappeared. The leader tried to get as far away from Rogue as possible, then began to exchange attacks with Rogue. Rogue realized that his opponent's feint to the right was just a trick, and that the double attack was the real one, yet he managed to dodge it. After that, Rogue kicked the adventurer hard, sending him flying into the wall. The onlookers were amazed at how quickly the fight ended. With one devastating blow, Rogue knocked the leader to the ground, striking fear into the hearts of the remaining adventurers who could not believe their leader had been defeated so quickly. As Rogue was about to finish off the rest, a blond man suddenly appeared and stopped the fight, declaring that he could give Rogue what he wanted. The adventurers recognized the man and called him Guildmaster. The man introduced himself as Thor Finland, the master of the Northern Adventurers Guild Garm, and suggested they move to another place to talk. In the Guildmaster's office, Thor began by mentioning the story of the skeleton that the adventurers in the mountain behind Changtap village were talking about. He explained that they had sent several reconnaissance teams to investigate, but they had returned empty-handed, which made them think it was just a rumor. Expressing his surprise that it was true, Rogue interrupted him sharply, stating that he had no time to waste, and asked him to state his request directly. Then, Thor explained that his request was simple. He explained that this guild, despite belonging to the Empire, had suffered from long neglect. The villagers had abandoned their homes in search of safety, and those who remained had died in reckless missions to defend their town, while the rest lived in constant fear of monster attacks. The guildmaster told Rogue that they were just slowly waiting for death. Rogue berated the guildmaster, asking if he was trying to complain about their misfortune, and told him that if they didn't want to die, they should have resisted the Empire. He added that if one does nothing, nothing will change. Thor replied that it wasn't that they did nothing, but that they couldn't do anything. He explained that the responsibility for law and order in the lands abandoned by the Empire fell on those who remained. The adventurers who shared the same will gathered to protect their homes, and the other guilds poured everything they had into protecting their families and homes, which left them in a situation no different from their current one. Rogue asked if they had ever considered forming an alliance between the guilds to fight the Empire. Thor replied that Rogue was putting it simply, but that would mean declaring war, and it wasn't just about courage. He added that countless people would die. Thor admitted that they had been waiting for someone to save them. He continued, saying that they had desperately held on in anticipation of hope, and then the heroine appeared. Her warm hope lifted them out of despair, and they believed she might be able to save them all. But he added sadly that they had clung to a false hope and wondered where they had gone wrong, and whether it was all just foolishness and a weak attachment. Then Thor looked at Rogue with determination, explaining that meeting him today had made him realize what they were lacking, which was hatred. His perspective had changed. He no longer cared if tomorrow didn't come or if their homes were destroyed. If they could kill their enemies, then death was a price worth paying, for that was the reality of war. Then, Thor made a request to Rogue, pledging to immediately assign 2 adventurers to accompany him, and that they would later gather everything they had to support him. He begged him, whether he was an Avenger or a demon, not to care about his identity, and to allow them all to join his war. Rogue apologized, saying that he didn't mean to destroy his guild, and admitted that the fault was also his for letting the Empire neglect these lands until the village's situation reached this state. Rogue agreed to the request, noting that 150 years had passed since he last accepted a request, then placed a red adventurer's card on the table. Thor was stunned, wondering if this was a Ruby-class adventurer's card from the Great War era, which was the highest rank but had long since disappeared. Thor asked about Rogue's true identity, but Rogue told him not to worry about it, describing himself as just a ghost from a dirty past. He then announced his acceptance of the request, explaining that his first destination was the Northern Mountain Range, the greatest and most dangerous mountain range on the continent, where the snow never stops falling. Rogue began to take the road from Qingtap village to the adventurer's post in the north. 5 days after leaving the village, Rogue and his 2 adventurer companions were moving cautiously along the mountain range. Rogue commented that they were moving at a very fast pace for a secret march. One of the adventurers, watching the horizon with his binoculars, replied that they couldn't risk running into the Empire's army. Rogue confirmed that they were indeed moving quickly. Muir and Sammy saw another group of people on the horizon, and Rogue wondered who they were and how they had managed to get ahead of them. One of them guessed that they were probably not a search party chasing them, then realized they were survivors from the village of Qingtap, and it seemed they had joined others who were looting villages on their way back to the capital. His companion, Sword Harriet, concluded that their path had been cut off while trying to move along the mountain range, which was confirmed by their lack of winter clothing. Rogue turned to his 2 companions and asked the guide about their destination if they took the lower path. Muir and Sammy corrected him, introducing himself and his companion, Sword Harriet, asking Rogue to at least remember their names. He then answered his question, explaining that there were small, scattered houses along the road, and Sword Harriet predicted that the group would raid them in search of food and supplies. Sword Harriet commented bitterly that looting houses had become common for the Empire's knights, and that the provinces had gotten used to it since the current emperor ascended the throne. After a moment of thought, Rogue calmly announced that he must eliminate them. Before his companions could comprehend what he had said, he leaped from the top of the cliff, leaving them in a state of shock and disbelief. Down below, chaos erupted among the soldiers who shouted warnings of a possible ambush. Rogue landed in their midst, confirming their fears. Sword Harriet rushed forward, shouting and wondering if he was that desperate to die. From above, Muir and Sammy watched the scene and told his companion that the man was already dead. The alarm sounded among the soldiers as they recognized the attacker, calling him the necromancer of Qingtap village. Rogue began to move among the knights, taking them down one by one, while the cries of others for mercy rose up. The commander ordered his men to stop retreating and to surround the attacker. He tried to urge them to attack together since the enemy was just one person, but his words were cut short by a blast of Rogue's purple energy that killed him. Rogue mocked the dead commander, asking if he really thought he was alone, and if his eyes were just for decoration. Then, Rogue unleashed his true power, summoning a terrifying army of purple specters and spirits. Sword Harriet watched the scene from a distance, realizing that the power Rogue had shown at the Adventurers Guild was only a small fraction of his full strength. The ghostly army descended upon the soldiers and tore through their ranks. Muir and Sammy recognized those spirits in terror, describing them as the ghosts of Qingtap village. As the battle neared its end, Muir and Sammy suggested they go down. Sword Harriet agreed, noting that the battle was decided and would soon be over. In the final scene, a lone knight charged in a desperate attack towards Rogue, letting out a final cry. Rogue parried the final knight's attack, easily dodging his spear, then kicked him hard in the head before he fell to the ground. Rogue saw a golden necklace around the knight's neck, whose helmet had partially shattered as he fell dead. The necklace brought Rogue back in time, to when the adventurer had given him that necklace as a token of apology, admitting they couldn't help but be suspicious of someone with his appearance. The man explained that the necklace was a good luck charm for adventurers, made by his daughter. Rogue accepted the gift and asked him to thank his daughter, but the man sadly told him that the Imperial army had killed her 2 years ago. Rogue immediately apologized, but the man reassured him not to, explaining that everyone in the village carried similar wounds and cursed the Empire, and that they were nothing more than human butchers burning what's left of their lives for the sake of revenge. He then offered him a piece of advice, asking him not to ruin his life by seeking revenge as they had. He added that everyone in this world has someone waiting for them, and he was sure the same applied to Rogue, begging him not to go too far down that path. The memory faded, and Rogue stood before the knight, who had been stabbed in the back by one of Rogue's monsters with a spear, and whose last words were an apology to his daughter, Michelle. Rogue clenched his fist tightly, struck the ghost with force, and it immediately dissipated. His companions approached him, and Muir and Sammy praised him, telling him he had done well. He offered for them to take care of cleaning up the place and collecting the bodies he would need to create more undead, while he rested. But Rogue surprised them by ordering all the bodies to be burned. His companions expressed their surprise, commenting that he was a peculiar necromancer, and Sword Harriet noticed the deep expression of sadness on his face. As Rogue watched the burning flames, the voice of the Demon King echoed in his mind, asking him mockingly, "See? What did I tell you? It's your turn, isn't it?" The voice continued its warning that Rogue would be forced to make countless choices, would sink into a despair he had never known, and that the real despair had not yet begun. Rogue shouted in anger, ordering the voice to be silent and to stay in the underworld as long as it was dead. The specter of the Demon King laughed loudly, asking how Rogue thought he would survive in his current state. It then told him to struggle as he wished and try to defy fate. But at the end of his path awaited a despair that not even the Demon King himself knew, and dared him to try to escape his destiny. Elsewhere, Frey, one of the war knights, was enjoying the sight of a burning kingdom, expressing her admiration for the sound of people's screams and the smell of the fire. One of her soldiers informed her that the men wanted to play football with the princess's head, but she refused, justifying it by saying her heart was broken. She had thought this kingdom was large enough to offer an enjoyable fight. But the battle ended quickly and boringly. She wondered with boredom if there was anyone in the Empire crazy enough to start a fight. At that moment, a messenger from the Empire arrived, announcing the appearance of a huge army of the undead at the northern wall and issuing the Emperor's order to subdue the evil necromancer leading that army. Frey laughed happily, amazed at the quick appearance of such a madman. She then stood up and ordered her troops to assemble, declaring it was time to go to war. Meanwhile, Sword Harriet and Muir and Sammy were talking as they marched with a silent Rogue. Muir and Sammy commented that Rogue had been walking like a corpse for 2 weeks without saying a word, adding that there was something strange about it, wondering how a head could float in the air like that. Sword Harriet recalled the guild leader's words that this undead from Changtap village was likely related to the recently deceased heroine. He pointed out that Changtap village was also where the heroine had spent her childhood, and that the timing of her escape from the knights to the village coincided with the undead army incident. Most importantly, Rogue's fighting style was an exact replica of the heroine's. The guild leader concluded that Rogue was probably not a bad person, but just someone desperate and struggling just like them. Although he didn't know why he was heading to the northern mountain range, he was sure that Rogue was not their enemy. At the same time, there was no guarantee that he was their ally, but he was certainly the key to overthrowing the Empire. Thor Finland, the guildmaster, had told the adventurers that he would entrust them with the task of guiding Rogue since they were from the north. Sword Harriet wondered if someone as unpredictable as Rogue would act according to their will, but Thor reassured them, expressing confidence in his good intuition. On their way, Sword Harriet pointed in the direction of Changtap village. Rogue agreed to stop there, which brought back memories of the past, when his disciple would put a paper bag over his head, and the happy moments they spent together in the village. When Rogue entered the familiar tavern, the owner greeted him. She told him he was too late if he had come in search of old memories, as the tavern had been closed for a long time. Then she asked him if he still used that bread bag, revealing that she knew him. Rogue was surprised that she was able to recognize him. The tavern owner explained that she knew he was the teacher of the girl who had worked for her, and that she had heard many stories about him, but she didn't know he was a talking living dead. After that, she poured him a glass of a cheap wine called Dione, and explained that its name meant a new beginning. She revealed to him that his disciple had entrusted her with this drink before she left, hoping to drink it with him one day to celebrate their journey. She added that sharing this wine had become a custom among adventurers as a wish for a safe journey, but she sadly mentioned that this wine hadn't been sold for a long time, as there were no more adventurers in the village. She then confronted Rogue, saying that she understood his motives for rebelling in a ruined country, but she believed the path of revenge he was on was wrong. She questioned whether the image he had become, even if he succeeded in saving the people of the Empire in the end, was really what his disciple would have wanted for him. She affirmed that she didn't think so, and that the girl would have wanted something brighter for him. She then told him that his disciple had left other things with her to pass on to him. She explained that the girl's dream was to live a fairy tale, gather companions, save people, and defeat evil. She had wanted to embark on an adventure like the tales of the legendary Ruby-class adventurers, and she wanted to experience it with him. The word adventure echoed in Rogue's mind, and he realized how hatred can blind people and make even the wise lose their way. He wondered if his anger was causing him to repeat the same mistakes again. He admitted to himself that although everyone called him a teacher, he had, in fact, only learned from his disciple. With renewed determination, Rogue decided to carry their hearts and dreams on his shoulders. He thanked the tavern owner for the drink, and turned to leave. As he was leaving, it seemed as if her spirit was asking him where he was heading now. Rogue remembered the meaning of the wine, a new beginning. He declared that since he had drunk it, it was time to set out again. This time, his journey would not be for revenge, but to experience what his disciple had always wished for, an adventure. And so, the tale of the skeletal messenger began. When Rogue came out, his two companions greeted him and asked if his story was over. Muir and Sammy joked that they would be taking the normal road from now on, and that Rogue was lucky he was just bones or he would be freezing from the cold. Rogue replied sharply, calling them his lacking little ones, which surprised them. Muir and Sammy noticed that Rogue's aura had changed, and Sword Harriet concluded that his worries were gone. Sword Harriet remembered the guildmaster's words, admiring his superior ability to judge people. Then the three of them set off on their way together. As they walked, Sword Harriet began to explain the current adventurer ranking system, explaining that it is divided into 10 ranks. From the highest, the 10th rank, Transcendent, to the lowest, the first rank, Earth, and the ranking is based on achievements. These ranks can be simplified into 4 categories: Transcendent, High, Middle, and Low. For safety reasons, adventurers cannot accept quests above their rank, and naturally, higher-ranked adventurers are paid handsomely. He explained that most people do not surpass the 7th rank, Topaz, and those who break through this barrier, known as the high-rank wall, are called Transcendent. 8th rank adventurers can explore unknown lands on their own, or fend off monster waves on the front lines by themselves as if they were an entire army. They might also be Imperial generals leading armies, but they would still be classified as high-rank adventurers. Defeating such people is the job of low-rank adventurers. As for those who kill huge monsters, they are the middle-rank adventurers. He then pointed out that the monsters they had faced were all high rank. He interrupted his explanation to ask Rogue if he was even listening, and Rogue replied that he was. Rogue then asked his companions about their ranks, and they replied that they were both 5th rank, Quartz. Rogue commented that the ranking system had changed a bit since his days as an adventurer, then jokingly claimed he was Ruby class and a famous female warrior. His companions were puzzled, and the name Ruby seemed to trigger something in Sword Harriet's memory. But Muir and Sammy burst out laughing, saying it was a silly joke and a rank from fairy tales, and mocked Rogue, who was terrified of the Legion of the Undead. Rogue wondered about the Legion of the Undead, while Muir and Sammy was still laughing. Suddenly, Rogue summoned a huge and terrifying purple monster, making his companions scream in fear as they begged him to let them down. After he let them down, Rogue mocked Sword Harriet's cowardice, saying that his courage for someone from the north was like iron barracks. This situation brought back to Rogue's mind the feeling of familiarity and fun that he had shared with his old comrades and his disciple. Then, Muir and Sammy asked Rogue why he was heading to the northern mountain range, describing the place as full of monsters, and monsters wearing human skin, and that its outskirts alone had become a monster garden. Rogue replied that he had promises with people there, and something he had to find. Rogue explained that his original plan was to invade with the remaining legion of the undead from the Demon King's army, but a bearded man had wiped out his entire army using a barrier. This astonished his companions, who wondered how that could be achieved with just a barrier generator. Rogue explained that the barrier was not ordinary, but was designed by the mage of the old hero's party, and was made specifically to repel waves of the undead on the front lines of the Demon King War, making its performance unparalleled. Since his army of the undead had been annihilated, Rogue concluded that he would need a human army to take down the Empire. He revealed his intention to recruit the northern tribes as allies. His companions were shocked by the idea, describing the northern tribes as madmen, but admitted they were the strongest fighting force on the continent if their loyalty could be won. Rogue admitted that his first plan was simpler, intending to cut off the Emperor's head and play football with it, but his beloved disciple had stopped him. Now, his goal was to rebuild the Empire the right way. Rogue felt the conversation had become too serious, so he decided to change the subject. He correctly guessed that his companions were youths who had failed the great hunt and run away, otherwise they wouldn't be wandering around those parts. He then playfully challenged them to a fight, saying he wouldn't go hard on them, but they tried to get out of it, claiming they were in a hurry. Rogue announced that it was too late, and they would play a nice little prank. He ordered them to run, and gave them a 10-second head start before summoning a giant monster to chase them. Sword Harriet shouted, trying to stop Muir and Sammy, realizing that Rogue was not just a madman, but Muir and Sammy ignored him, and ran, hoping they would meet again alive. Rogue began the countdown, and after he finished counting, the monster began to chase them relentlessly. Meanwhile, Rogue was thinking of his departed comrades, the heroine, and everyone, saying to himself that they were gone, but he still remembered them. Then he laughed out loud, announcing that they were his 2 foolish and unexpected disciples. He told them they should be grateful, because he would personally train them and turn them into human weapons. Rogue vowed that this time he would not lose his way. He asked his departed friends to watch over him until the end so he could maintain his identity, and so that the times to come would not be lonely. Elsewhere, Frey felt something, then announced she had found what she was looking for. Meanwhile, the monster Rogue had summoned was still chasing his companions through the forest. While Rogue's companions were screaming for help, begging him to stop before they actually died, Sword Harriet suddenly spotted someone jumping in the air towards the monster. Rogue, who was riding on the monster's back, was surprised by the sudden appearance of the war knight, Frey, who attacked the monster with a powerful sword strike, then climbed up to where Rogue was standing and launched a powerful attack at him. After landing on top of the monster, she greeted Rogue, who parried her next attack with his sword. Frey used a special combat technique that completely destroyed the summoned monster in a massive explosion. Murin Sammy called out to him in concern after he survived the blast. Rogue described Frey as rude for launching a surprise attack without a greeting. She introduced herself as Frey, one of the Empire's 4 knights, Frey of War, declaring she had come to wage war on him. Rogue immediately remembered the title, The 4 Knights, that the bearded man, Aisher, had mentioned, and realized she was one of them. Frey considered their exchange of greetings over, and that now she could fight, which Rogue agreed to, and the confrontation between them began. They clashed with force, leading to a huge explosion of energy that destroyed everything around them, and Frey quickly showed her superiority in physical combat, using her kicks and agile movements to overwhelm Rogue. Rogue steadied himself on his feet, noting that her fighting style was not at all ordinary. Her attacks came from unexpected angles, and her joints bent in strange ways, making fighting her feel like fighting a non-human creature. He concluded that she was a troubling character. Rogue launched a surprise rock towards her left eye, hitting it directly, then followed up with a rapid series of punches. Frey became enraged, then delivered a powerful blow that sent him flying. Frey suddenly stopped, expressing her disappointment. She had been expecting an army, and the fight itself was not on the level she had wanted. She asked Rogue why he couldn't concentrate properly, and sarcastically wondered if his 2 companions were distracting him, threatening that she would bury them with him. Rogue wondered if she really thought she could kill him. Rogue acknowledged her strength and unique combat sense, and the immense effort he felt from her, but he added that she had a weakness, which was her poor eyesight. She was shocked when she found a huge monster being summoned around her. While Rogue was fighting Frey, he yelled at his companions, Murin, and Sword, and ordered them to run immediately. At that moment, he threw a purple smoke bomb, causing Sword Harriet to cough and complain that he should have warned him first. Murin Sammy yelled at him, asking what he had put in the bomb. Rogue replied sarcastically, explaining that it was a mixture of ground T-bran pepper and blastfire turtlebone powder, and offered to share the recipe, but Sword Harriet angrily refused. Away from the fight, Rogue's companions wondered if he had a plan, stressing that even an army wouldn't be enough to defeat one of the 4 knights. Rogue admitted that in his current state, he couldn't stop her either. He explained that his plan now, after they had crossed the border marker, was to keep running and make as much noise as possible while they fled, but it was too late. Frey had already caught up with them. Frey appeared suddenly, laughing and mocking the legion of the undead that Rogue had summoned, asking him if this was the war she was promised. Then she launched a fierce attack using multiple techniques, resulting in a massive collision of energy. That destroyed the summoned monster and caused a huge explosion in the mountain. After the smoke cleared, Frey laughed, expressing her enjoyment of the fight, which included a huge undead monster and strange smoke bombs. In addition to Rogue's strange swordsmanship, she demanded more of a challenge. Rogue fell to the ground, kicking up dust, and scolded Frey for dirtying his robe, calling her a villain. Frey mocked him, asking if he had looked in a mirror, then remembered he had no eyes to see himself with. The 2 exchanged insults, with her mocking him for his pathetic escape, while he mocked her for falling into his trap despite her strength. Frey grumbled that he didn't recognize her ancient, death-like appearance, then wondered why he wasn't using more undead. She expressed her disappointment, describing him as strong, but strangely disappointing, wondering if his companions were distracting him. Then she calmly approached him and whispered in his ear, offering to kill them, so he could focus more on their fight, hoping that might anger him enough to fight desperately and show her his true power. Rogue was surprised by her audacity and confidence in approaching him like that, but she continued to mock him, saying he was still talking even though he had been beaten severely by her, and that it made her want to grind his head into powder. As she was speaking, sharp arrows that fell from the sky embedded themselves in her body, making her scream in pain and Rogue call her an arrogant brat. Then, Rogue told her to pay her respects, revealing to her that they had reached their destination, the mother mountain of the northern tribes, the Northern Mountain Range. Frey finally realized it, understanding why he had come all this way to the front yard of the northern tribes. Frey scoffed at Rogue's plan, describing it as just a cheap little trick. She told him he could try to persuade the tribes as much as he wanted, and that she would wait however long it took for the most enjoyable war ever. Then she left, saying she would be waiting for him. After she left, his companions found him, Sword Harriet expressed his relief that he was safe, while Murin Sammy pointed out that there were other men watching them from among the trees. Rogue greeted the hidden northern tribesmen among the trees, but his words were cut short by an arrow that suddenly pierced his hand. One of the tribesmen commented sarcastically on the talking skeleton, suggesting they cut off his head and use it as a drinking cup. Rogue and his companions realized that this was how the northern tribes welcomed strangers. So Rogue yelled at them and ordered them to run. An intruder alarm sounded, and the three began to run under a hail of arrows and spears. Murin Sammy angrily wondered why they were being attacked even though they were supposed to be allies, and when she asked him about the agreement Rogue had mentioned, Rogue explained that the agreement was from about 100 years ago. Rogue suggested that his companions mention their names since they were from the northern tribes, but they refused because it would be counterproductive since they were runaways. Murin added that Harriet had his own problems with someone there, so Rogue decided to introduce himself instead. Rogue stopped and asked them to stop attacking them, and announced his name as Benlira Edward, identifying himself as a member of the northern tribes and asking to meet their leader. The tribesmen doubted his words, but Rogue thought the problem was solved, only to be surprised when he and his companions were thrown into a cell. Sword Harriet sarcastically thanked Rogue for his great communication that led them to prison. Rogue hit him on the head after Sword Harriet mocked him. Then Murin Sammy asked Rogue if he was really from the northern tribes, and Rogue replied that he was, explaining that he had been one of them a long time ago. Sword Harriet panicked, realizing they were in a real crisis. Murin Sammy explained that she had recognized the place while they were being led away, and that they were in the Red Ram village. She revealed that their original plan was to accompany him only to the mountain entrance and avoid any direct contact with the tribes. Their conversation was interrupted by the prison guard who called for the living dead, telling him the chief wanted him. Rogue was led through the snowy village, and he noticed that nothing had changed. Rogue was brought before the chief of the Red Ram tribe, a man named Red Silk. The chief addressed him, accusing him of daring to impersonate a member of the northern tribes. The chief continued his accusation, saying to Sword Harriet that he had the audacity to return here alive. Sword Harriet tried to deny it, but the chief insisted on his position. Rogue asked him to first remove his restraints so they could talk, insisting that he was indeed from the northern tribes. The chief refused his request, calling him a stranger, and warning him that impersonating members of the northern tribes was a grave sin, especially since he had brought with him those he described as failures, those who couldn't even consider themselves part of the tribe. Rogue realized that those who failed the great hunt were no longer treated as human, and noted bitterly that just as the village scenery hadn't changed, their old fanatical customs hadn't changed either. In a sudden move, Rogue shattered the wooden restraints that bound his hands. His words angered the tribe's chief, who warned him not to speak of things he didn't understand. One of the chief's assistants tried to speak with him, but the chief ordered him to stop, declaring he would handle the situation himself because that skeletal bastard was starting to get on his nerves. The chief became enraged and rushed towards Rogue, vowing to tear him apart. Rogue dodged his charging attack with 2 axes, and in a masterful move, used the man's own force to shatter his companions' restraints, who were stunned by the dangerous maneuver. Rogue ordered his companions to step back while he prepared to face the warrior. The two clashed in a fierce fight, and Sword Harriet watched the scene in amazement, astonished by Rogue's ability to block every one of the warrior's powerful blows, which were like cannonballs. All the warriors began to flee the area, fearing the force of the battle's impact. After a series of violent blows, Rogue approached the chief. The chief mocked Rogue, asking if that was all he had. Rogue replied that it wasn't, and dealt him a powerful blow. The chief commented mockingly that he was very light, which was to be expected since he was only bones. Then he delivered a crushing punch that seemed to shatter his skull, declaring that the dead should not walk beside the living, and their fate is to turn to dust. Suddenly the chief fell to the ground, only to discover that his body was completely frozen. Rogue had managed to hit a pressure point in his body without him noticing. At that moment, Rogue completed the warrior's sentence in a calm voice, saying, "The dead turn to dust and fade away, and the living remember them and move on." This phrase seemed very familiar to Rogue, who realized he had heard it his whole life. Rogue stood tall over the paralyzed chief, mockingly asking how the living could be kneeling on his knees, while the dead was the one walking upright. He continued his mockery, wondering how the warrior was unable to take a single step, while he was the one advancing towards him. Then Rogue declared in a decisive tone that it was time to talk now. At that moment, the chief felt he had been completely defeated, and that this confrontation reminded him of training with his master as a child. He admitted his defeat and asked Rogue what he wanted. Rogue's request was clear: to summon all the chiefs of the northern tribes because they were going to march against the Empire. The tribesmen rushed to help their chief, who accepted his defeat, and promised Rogue he would invite him to the Great Council of the Northern Tribes, which would be held soon. But he warned him that this didn't mean he trusted him and ordered him to stay at Harriet's mansion until then, noting that that old man was still running the place. Rogue was confused, wondering about Harriet's mansion. The chief was surprised by Rogue's ignorance of the place even though he had reached the lands of the Red Ram tribe. Then he laughed sarcastically and revealed to him that his companion's real name was Sword Hooker Harriet, the heir to the allied White Lion's Mane tribe. Thus, the true identity of Rogue's companion, Sword Hooker Harriet, was revealed. The three arrived at Sword Hooker Harriet's mansion, in the territory of the Red Ram tribe, and entered it. Rogue commented that seeing that sweaty adventurer walking around so elegantly now was quite shocking. Harriet explained that he had abandoned the name Hooker the day he fled the mountains, and that he had no desire to maintain his ties to this house. He admitted that the place made him feel very uncomfortable, then withdrew to his room. Rogue commented that Harriet seemed like a completely different person, and Murin Sammy agreed with him. At that moment, an old man greeted them and introduced himself as Ban Sun, the caretaker of this mansion. Rogue began to introduce himself and Murin, but Ban Sun gently interrupted him, explaining that there was no need for introductions. He welcomed Murin, asking her how she was, and Murin replied that she was in the best of health. Ban Sun explained to Rogue that Murin was the gardener's daughter, and that she used to take care of the flower gardens in the mansion with her father. He added that, although she acted as a friend, she was technically Lord Harriet's attendant. Rogue showed interest, commenting that it was hard to believe that Harriet was supposed to be the next chief, and asked to know more about him. Ban Sun confirmed that Lord Harriet was indeed the heir, and that he was temporarily staying with the Red Ram tribe to study abroad, to be recognized as a warrior, and to learn how to lead his tribe as the future chief. He had brought his attendants here to train and learn. Due to the constant wars with the Empire's knights over territory, this place was the perfect training ground. Ban Sun explained that Lord Harriet trained hard day after day, but perhaps due to the shock of his repeated failures in the Great Hunt, he suddenly disappeared 4 years ago with Murin. Eventually, the servants couldn't bear it any longer and returned one by one to the White Lion's Mane tribe, while he remained alone to manage the mansion. When Rogue asked him why he stayed, Ban Sun replied that the house should not be left dirty when Lord Harriet returned. He added that Murin felt the same way and still believed in him, and that all their tribe members were waiting for Lord Harriet's return. Later, Rogue found Murin in the garden. She told him she had been tending to the garden a little, as her family were the gardeners at the mansion. She described Harriet as a good leader, and although that wasn't the only reason she ran away with him, she began to tell Rogue an old story. Her memories took her back to the day of their arrival, when her father, Bo Sammy, introduced himself and his daughter Murin to the chief of the White Lion's Mane tribe, Hooker Lyman Rice, and Harriet's father. The chief welcomed them, sitting on his throne, and told them that their seeking refuge here was most likely the will of the Mother Mountain, and invited them to live there as one of them. Murin continued her story, saying that her father had pledged to repay the kindness with his life. Then the chief ordered his son Harriet to take Murin on a tour of the territory. Harriet was shy at first, but Murin quickly broke the ice between them with a small joke, where she offered him a hot piece of candy. That made him scream in pain, then introduced herself playfully. Harriet tried to remind her of his higher rank, but she questioned the importance of ranks, and asked him if ranks mattered when they played together, which made him stammer and admit she was right. Then, she affectionately called him a fool. From that day on, they became close friends, spending their time playing and adventuring together, while the servants watched them from a distance. Murin explained that Harriet never treated her with condescension, as she never flattered him to gain his favor, or sought anything from him. She saw him as a normal person, not as the chief's son, and that was the first time Harriet felt he was seen for who he truly was. A few years later, Harriet worriedly asked Murin if she thought he could ever become like his parents. He was preparing to go to the Red Ram tribe to study, but he wasn't confident in his abilities. Murin scoffed at his worry, but she reassured him, saying she believed in him as the White Lion believes. Upon his arrival, he was greeted by the chief of the Red Ram tribe, Red Silk, who became his master. His training began harshly, emphasizing the importance of never hesitating or stopping, as the chief must be the strongest warrior and the pillar of the tribe. He warned him of the consequences of defeat in battle, as defeat meant losing his voice and the disintegration of his tribe. He assured him that physical strength is national strength, and that his strength would become the strength of his tribe. He also urged him to use his mind, to constantly think and observe the battlefield, and to always remember that one mistake could cost his tribe members their lives. Red Silk continued to explain the requirements of Harriet's training, explaining to him that the library contained 2,250 books with records of the North's laws, its history, monster data, and other vital knowledge. He ordered him to learn them all. Harriet felt overwhelmed and under immense pressure as he studied amidst piles of books, wondering to himself if he could really do it. But he drew strength from the memory of Murin's encouraging smile, and resolved to do his best. About a year after Harriet began his training under the Red Ram tribe, Murin received shocking news. It was said that Harriet had run away,